The steam from the washing vats had always made my fingers prune, but that morning they trembled for a different reason. There, clutched between my wrinkled thumb and forefinger, was a scrap of paper that would change everything. I found it in His Grace's shirt pocket, a cream-colored linen affair with pearl buttons that cost more than my yearly wages. As I stared at the torn note, memories of countless mornings spent in this very laundry room washed over me. The monotonous rhythm of scrubbing, wringing, and pressing that had once felt like a prison now seemed like a shield against the world outside these steamy walls. How strange that a simple piece of paper could make me long for those tedious hours. Lucy. Mrs. Winters's sharp voice cut through the humid air of the palace laundry, startling me from my reverie. Those shirts won't press themselves. I quickly tucked the paper into my apron pocket, my heart drumming against my ribs. 15 years of washing royal garments had taught me one thing. Everything in these walls had eyes. Even now, I could feel the weight of gazes from the other laundry maids, though they pretended to be absorbed in their work. The note had been torn hastily, its edges ragged. Only a few words remained legible through the washing water's damage. Midnight, North Tower. The Queen must not. The rest was lost to the soap and water, but those few words sent chills down my spine despite the room's oppressive heat. I smoothed His Grace's shirt with trembling hands, the iron's heat mixing with the perpetual dampness of the laundry. The North Tower, that crumbling section of the palace where even servants feared to tread. What business could His Grace have there? And more importantly, what was being kept from the Queen? As I worked, my mind wandered to the Queen herself. Unlike some of the nobility, she had always treated us below-stairs folk with kindness. I remembered the Christmas when she had visited the laundry, bringing with her the scent of cinnamon and pine. She had smiled at each of us, asking our names and thanking us for our service. It was more than mere politeness. There was a genuine warmth in her eyes that had made even Mrs. Winters soften her perpetual scowl. "You're awfully quiet today, Lucy," said Mary, the youngest of our washerwomen. Her fresh face reminded me of myself when I'd first arrived at the palace, before I learned that the grandest houses held the darkest secrets. "Just tired," I murmured, carefully folding the pressed shirt. My fingers brushed against my apron pocket, the paper's presence burning like a hot coal against my thigh. The palace bells chimed 10, their deep resonance vibrating through the stone walls. 2 hours until the upstairs maids would collect the morning's washing. Through the high windows, I could see the North Tower's silhouette against the autumn sky, its weathered stones holding whatever secret His Grace was so desperate to hide. Share your thoughts. What do you think His Grace is hiding in the North Tower? I'd seen enough in my years here to know that nobility's secrets were best left undisturbed. There was the time the Duchess of Marlborough's letters disappeared from her chambers, or when the king's favorite hunting dog mysteriously vanished. Both incidents followed by whispered conversations that stopped the moment a servant entered the room. But this felt different. The Queen had always been kind to us below-stairs folk. Last winter, when my mother fell ill, Her Majesty had sent her own physician to tend to her. I remembered the way the doctor's eyes had widened when he realized he'd been summoned to a laundrymaid's modest home. But he had treated my mother with the same care he would have shown any noble lady, all because the Queen had commanded it. The thought of someone plotting against her made my blood boil, the heat rising in my cheeks matching the steam that filled the laundry room. "Lucy!" Mrs. Winters appeared beside me, her gray eyes sharp as needles. "You've pressed that same shirt 3 times now. Are you feeling well?" I startled, realizing I'd been lost in thought. Mrs. Winters' face, usually as stern as the palace's stone walls, showed a flicker of concern. In that moment, I saw not just my taskmaster of 15 years, but a woman who had spent her entire life in service to the crown. How many secrets had she seen pass through this laundry, hidden in pockets and hemlines? "Yes, Mrs. Winters. Sorry, Mrs. Winters," I managed to stammer out. As she walked away, I made my decision. Tonight, after the palace settled into its midnight quiet, I would find out what was happening in the North Tower. If someone was plotting against the Queen, I had to know. Even if it cost me my position, or worse. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of steam and starched linens. Every creak of the floorboards above made me jump, certain that someone had discovered my theft of the note. By noon, my nerves were as frayed as the old lace we used to test the iron's heat. I waited until the lunch bell rang, then slipped away from the laundry while the others headed to the servants' hall. The palace corridors were a maze I knew by heart, though I rarely had reason to venture beyond the basement levels. Today, I needed to prepare for tonight's mission. The North Tower's base was accessible through the old kitchen gardens, long abandoned after the new kitchens were built. If I was going to investigate tonight, I needed to know exactly where I was going. One wrong turn in the dark could mean discovery, or worse. As I made my way through the lesser-used corridors, I couldn't help but notice how the quality of light changed. Down in the laundry, everything was obscured by steam and shadow. But here, sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny courtiers. It was beautiful, in its way. But it also made me feel exposed, vulnerable. What would you risk to protect someone who showed you kindness? I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the voices echoing from the cross corridor. Instinct took over, and I pressed myself against the wall, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Absolutely certain? A man's voice, refined and familiar. It took me a moment to place it. Lord Blackthorn, one of His Grace's closest confidants. Yes, Your Grace. Everything is arranged for tonight. This second voice I didn't recognize, but its tone sent a shiver down my spine. I held my breath as they passed the intersection, not daring to peek around the corner. Their footsteps faded, but their words left me colder than the deepest palace cellar. As silence returned to the corridor, I found myself sliding down the wall, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. The enormity of what I was involving myself in crashed over me like a wave. I was just a laundry maid. What business did I have uncovering plots and secrets? But then I remembered the Queen's kindness, the warmth in her eyes when she spoke to us. I thought of my mother, alive because of Her Majesty's generosity. And I knew that no matter how terrified I was, I couldn't turn back now. With trembling hands, I pushed myself back to my feet. The North Tower awaited, and with it, secrets that could shake the very foundations of the kingdom. As I resumed my journey, the weight of the stolen note in my pocket felt heavier than ever. A reminder that sometimes, destiny calls from the most unexpected places. The afternoon hours crawled by like wounded creatures. Every time I passed Mrs. Winters, I felt her suspicious gaze following me. Had she noticed the change in my behavior? The weight of the note in my pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, like a stone dragging me toward some inevitable fate. As I folded linens, my mind wandered to the history of the North Tower. It was old, older than most of the palace, if the stories were to be believed. I remembered old Tom, the groundskeeper who had retired last year, telling tales of secret passages and forgotten chambers within its walls. At the time, I had dismissed them as the ramblings of a man who had spent too many years in the sun. Now, I wondered what truths might be hidden in those stories. "You should eat something, Lucy," Mary said during our evening break, pushing a piece of bread across the worn wooden table. "You're white as the Queen's best linens." I forced myself to take a bite, though it tasted like ash in my mouth. The servants' hall buzzed with its usual evening chatter, but tonight the familiar sounds felt distant, as if I were hearing them from underwater. Through the narrow window, I watched the sun sink behind the North Tower, painting its ancient stones in shades of blood and gold. As I stared at the tower, a memory surfaced. a scrap of conversation I had overheard years ago between two of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. They had been discussing the tower, their voices hushed and fearful. "It's not right," one had said. "Some places should be left to sleep." At the time, I hadn't understood. Now their words took on a new, ominous meaning. Have you ever felt the weight of a secret pressing down on your very soul? As the palace settled into its nighttime routine, I made my preparations. A stolen candle stub tucked into my apron pocket alongside the damning note. A pair of soft-soled shoes borrowed from the rag bin. Not stolen, I told myself, just borrowed. The night watch would make their rounds at midnight, then again at 2. That gave me a precious hour to discover what His Grace was hiding. The clock struck 11, and I began my journey. The palace at night was a different creature altogether. Familiar corridors transformed into shadowy canyons, everyday sounds magnified into mysterious echoes. My feet knew the way, even as my mind screamed at me to turn back. As I crept through the darkened halls, I couldn't help but think of all the lives that had passed through these corridors over the centuries. How many other servants had skulked in these shadows, carrying secrets that could topple kingdoms? How many of them had disappeared, their fates known only to the silent stones around me? The old kitchen gardens were a tangle of neglected herbs and crumbling walls. Moonlight filtered through bare branches, casting skeletal shadows across my path. The scent of wild rosemary, crushed beneath my feet, brought back memories of my grandmother's cottage, a place of safety and warmth that felt a lifetime away from this moment. The North Tower loomed above me, its windows dark except for one, a faint glimmer near the top, like a star fallen to earth. As I approached, the air grew colder, carrying a strange scent I couldn't quite place, something ancient and vaguely metallic. I pressed my hand against the tower's base, feeling the cold stone beneath my fingers. The texture was odd, not the smooth surface I expected, but covered in tiny, intricate patterns that seemed to shift under my touch. I pulled my hand back, unsettled, and focused on the task at hand. The ancient door was locked, of course, but years of watching the palace craftsmen had taught me a thing or two. A hairpin and a prayer were sometimes all you needed. As I worked on the lock, I thought of Mrs. Winters and her uncanny ability to know everything that happened in the laundry. Would she notice my absence? And if she did, would she raise the alarm or keep my secret? The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire palace. I froze, counting heartbeats, waiting for shouts of discovery that never came. When I finally dared to breathe again, I slipped inside like a ghost. The tower's interior was thick with dust and memories. My candle's light revealed worn spiral stairs, hugging the curved wall, disappearing into darkness above. But it was the walls themselves that caught my attention. At first glance, they seemed to be covered in an intricate tapestry. But as I looked closer, I realized the patterns were carved directly into the stone, swirling designs that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. I gathered my courage and began to climb, each step a choice between truth and safety. The stairs seemed endless, my candle's flame casting strange shadows that danced and twisted around me. Was that movement above just the flickering light, or something more? As I climbed, the carvings on the walls became more pronounced, more alive. They reminded me of the illustrations in the ancient books I had glimpsed in the palace library, all curves and angles that hurt the eyes if you looked at them too long. What stories did these walls tell? And more importantly, who or what had written them? Voices drifted down from above, stopping me mid-step. I pinched out my candle, plunging myself into darkness as the words became clearer. The documents must be ready before she arrives. His Grace's voice, tighter than I'd ever heard it. Everything depends on timing. And if she discovers them too soon? A woman's voice, familiar yet strange. It took me a moment to place it. Lady Margaret, the Queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting. But there was something off about her tone, an underlying resonance that sent chills down my spine. Then all is lost. The Queen cannot know until... A floorboard creaked beneath my foot, cutting off His Grace's words. The voices above fell silent. My heart stopped as footsteps moved toward the stairs. What secrets would be worth dying to protect? I pressed myself against the wall, praying the darkness would swallow me whole. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the growing light of a lantern. In that moment, I realized I had two choices: run and live with the mystery forever, or stand my ground and face whatever truth waited above. As the light grew brighter, illuminating the strange carvings around me, I made my decision. I had come too far to turn back now. Whatever secrets the North Tower held, whatever plots were being hatched against the Queen, I would uncover them, even if it meant confronting His Grace himself. With trembling hands, I reached for the hairpin I had used to pick the lock. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had. As the footsteps reached the landing just above me, I steeled myself for what was to come. The truth waited in the room above, and with it, perhaps, the fate of the kingdom itself. I took a deep breath, tasting dust and that strange metallic scent on my tongue. Then, gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The approaching lantern light grew brighter, and in that moment of panic, I did something either very brave or very foolish. I moved upward instead of down. My feet found each step silently as I climbed, keeping to the outer edge where the wood was least likely to betray me. Behind me, the light bobbed closer, casting long shadows that reached for me like grasping fingers. As I ascended, the strange carvings on the walls seemed to come alive in the shifting light. They reminded me of the patterns I'd seen on the finest silks from the Far East, brought to the palace for royal ceremonies, but these were older, wilder somehow. I could have sworn I saw them move from the corner of my eye, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Must be the rats again," a man's voice grumbled. Not His Grace, but someone else. The voice was rough, unfamiliar. A guard, perhaps, or some other servant pulled into this conspiracy. "This tower's infested with them." I held my breath, pressing myself against the cold stone. The carvings seemed to pulse against my back, as if the wall itself was breathing. For a moment, I feared I might cry out, giving away my position. The footsteps paused, and I could hear the man sniffing the air. "Smell that?" he asked, seemingly to himself. "Like old copper and something else. Been getting stronger lately." I realized I'd been smelling it too, that strange metallic scent, growing more potent as I climbed higher in the tower. It reminded me of the time I'd cut my hand on a rusted nail as a child, that unique blend of blood and metal. The footsteps began descending, and I allowed myself a silent sigh of relief. But my respite was short-lived, as I realized I'd climbed all the way to a small landing. A sliver of light leaked from beneath a heavy wooden door, and with it, that copper smell grew stronger. "Must be more careful," the woman's voice drifted through, clearer now. Lady Margaret, but her tone was different from any I'd heard her use before. Colder, more authoritative. "The servants are already gossiping about the meetings." I inched closer, pressing my ear to the ancient wood. The splinters caught at my cap, but I didn't dare move to adjust it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to forget what I'd heard, and return to the safety of the laundry. But I thought of the Queen's kindness, of all she'd done for me and my family. I had to know what was happening. "Let them gossip," His Grace replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "By the time anyone understands what's happening, it will be too late." The Queen's signature on these documents will seal everything. My hand brushed against something wet on the doorframe. In the dim light, I could just make out fresh paint, black symbols that made my blood run cold. They weren't any letters or numbers I recognized, but they seemed to writhe before my eyes like living things. I was reminded of the strange books I'd glimpsed once in the palace library's restricted section, their covers adorned with similar markings. Have you ever stumbled upon something that made you question everything you thought you knew? A sudden draft stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of something burning. Not wood or coal, but something sweeter, more exotic. It reminded me of the incense the palace chaplain sometimes used during special ceremonies. But this was headier, more intoxicating. My head began to swim, and the symbols on the doorframe seemed to move more quickly now, dancing in my vision. "The preparation is almost complete," Lady Margaret said, her voice taking on an odd, echoing quality. "Once Her Majesty signs the trade agreement tomorrow." "Trade agreement?" I whispered to myself, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The Queen had announced a major trade agreement with the neighboring kingdom just yesterday, one that would bring prosperity to both realms. I remembered the excitement in the servants' hall, everyone talking about the new opportunities it would bring. But now, those hopeful conversations took on a sinister tone in my memory. The voices inside stopped abruptly. "Someone's there!" His Grace snapped, his voice sharp with alarm. I turned to flee, but my legs wouldn't obey. The sweet-smelling smoke seemed to have filled my lungs, making everything spin. I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself, my fingers smearing through the wet symbols. As I touched them, a jolt of something, energy, magic, shot through my body, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. The door flew open. Light blazed out, blinding me. Through my dazzled vision, I saw His Grace standing there, but he looked wrong somehow. Taller, darker, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like a cat's. For a moment, I was reminded of the stories my grandmother used to tell, tales of creatures that wore human skins, but were anything but human underneath. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of the room. Walls covered in more of those writhing symbols, a table laid out with papers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. And standing over them, a figure that couldn't possibly be human. It wore Lady Margaret's face, but its proportions were all wrong, its movements too fluid to belong to any person I'd ever seen. "Well," His Grace said, his voice resonating in a way that made my bones ache. "It seems we have an unexpected guest. Bring her in. She's already seen too much to leave." Strong hands gripped my arms, pulling me forward into that impossible room. As my vision cleared, I saw the truth of what was happening in the North Tower, a truth that no laundry maid was ever meant to discover. The walls pulsed with otherworldly light, the symbols moving and rearranging themselves like a living language. The air was thick with that sweet metallic scent, and I could feel power thrumming through the stone beneath my feet. His Grace, or whatever creature wore his form, loomed over me. "Tell me, girl," he said, his voice a mixture of curiosity and menace. "What do you think you've stumbled into?" I wanted to be brave, to stand tall and demand answers. But in that moment, faced with horrors beyond my understanding, I felt every bit the simple laundry maid I was. Tears welled in my eyes as I realized the enormity of what I'd discovered, and the price I might have to pay for that knowledge. The room swam into focus, and I wished it hadn't. What I'd taken for wallpaper was actually hundreds of those black symbols, crawling across every surface like living ink. They pulsed with an eerie light, casting shadows that moved independently of anything in the room. The air was thick with that sweet, metallic scent, making my head spin and my stomach churn. The figure I'd glimpsed earlier resolved into a woman wearing the face of Lady Margaret, the Queen's trusted lady-in-waiting. But something about her movements was wrong, as if her joints bent in ways they shouldn't. She glided across the room, her feet barely seeming to touch the floor, and I was reminded of the way eels moved in water, smooth, alien, and somehow threatening. A laundry maid, His Grace mused, circling me like a wolf sizing up its prey. His voice had changed, becoming deeper, more resonant, with undertones that made my teeth ache. How perfectly convenient. Tell me, girl, do you know what you've stumbled into? I wanted to be brave, to stand tall and demand answers, but the truth was, I was terrified. My voice trembled as I forced the words out. You're plotting against the Queen, the trade agreement. A laugh burst from his throat, but it wasn't a human sound. It was more like the cracking of ice on a frozen lake, sharp and cold and full of hidden dangers. Plotting against her? Oh no, my dear. We're saving her. Saving all of you, though you're too simple to understand it. His words stirred a memory, a conversation I'd overheard years ago between two of the older servants. They had been discussing the royal bloodline, how it was said to carry some ancient power. At the time, I'd dismissed it as mere gossip. Now I wasn't so sure. The question is, His Grace continued, leaning in close enough that I could smell his breath, like old parchment and something metallic. Will you help us? Or will you join the others? The others? I managed to ask, my mouth dry with fear. Lady Margaret, or whatever wore her form, gestured to a dark corner of the room. As my eyes adjusted, I made out several figures standing perfectly still, their faces blank. With horror, I recognized Thomas, the footman who'd disappeared last month, and Sarah, a kitchen maid everyone assumed had run off with a merchant's son. But they weren't just standing still. They weren't breathing. Their eyes were open but unseeing, and their skin had a waxy, translucent quality that made my stomach turn. They looked like dolls, or puppets, waiting for someone to pull their strings. They refused to understand the necessity of our work, His Grace said, his tone almost regretful. He ran a finger along Sarah's cheek, and I swore I saw her twitch, just slightly. The Queen's signature on tomorrow's trade agreement isn't just about commerce between kingdoms. It's about opening doors that have been sealed for centuries. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a sickly light, and I felt something vast and hungry stirring behind them. The smoke in the air grew thicker, and with it came whispers in languages that human tongues were never meant to speak. I caught fragments of words that seemed to slip away as soon as I tried to focus on them, leaving behind only a sense of vertigo and wrongness. Our realm is dying, Lady Margaret said, her voice overlapping with something deeper, older. It reminded me of the sound of the sea and the shells my father once brought back from a coastal trip, a vast ancient roar contained in something small and fragile. The old powers are fading. The agreement will bind both kingdoms to a new covenant, one that will restore what was lost. She moved to the table, running her two long fingers over the documents spread there. They seemed to ripple under her touch, the ink moving like it was alive. The Queen's bloodline carries the last trace of the ancient magic. Her willing signature, given in ignorance, will break the final seal. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The Queen's kindness, her genuine concern for her people, was that why they needed her signature to be given willingly? And what would happen to her once the seal was broken? I thought of all the times I'd seen the Queen up close, the way she seemed to glow from within, how plants seemed to bloom more vibrantly in her presence. Were these signs of the power His Grace and Lady Margaret spoke of? And if so, what right did they have to use it without her knowledge? Time grows short, His Grace said, his gaze flickering to an ornate clock on the wall. Its hands seemed to move erratically, sometimes forward, sometimes back. Dawn approaches, and with it, the signing ceremony. Make your choice, girl. Help us maintain order until the deed is done. or join our silent observers. I looked at Thomas and Sarah, their empty eyes staring at nothing. My fingers brushed against my apron pocket, feeling the note that had led me here. I thought of the Queen's physician, tending to my sick mother, her smile when she visited the laundry at Christmas, the way she always seemed to remember every servant's name. "I'll help," I whispered, hating myself for the words even as I spoke them. "I'll keep your secret." His Grace smiled, showing too many teeth. "Excellent. Lady Margaret, prepare the binding ritual. We can't have her warning anyone, even accidentally." As they moved to gather their twisted implements, I felt the weight of the stolen candle in my pocket. One of Mrs. Winter's first lessons echoed in my memory. "Proper laundering is about timing and temperature, girl. Too hot or too cold, too fast or too slow. It all matters." I had one chance to make this right. But first, I needed them to trust me just a little longer. I thought of the Queen, of all she had done for her people, of the kindness she had shown even to a lowly laundry maid, and I knew that whatever the cost, I had to try to save her. What would you sacrifice to protect everything you hold dear? My hand closed around the candle in my pocket, and I began to form a desperate plan. Whatever magic these creatures were wielding, I had to believe that something as simple and pure as fire might be able to disrupt it. After all, fire had been mankind's first defense against the terrors of the night since time immemorial. As Lady Margaret approached with a bowl of something that smoked and writhed, I steeled myself for what was to come. I might not understand the forces at play here, but I understood duty, loyalty, and the courage it took to stand against evil, no matter how powerful it might be. The ritual preparations gave me precious moments to think. His Grace and Lady Margaret moved about the room, arranging black candles in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. The symbols on the walls seemed to watch me, pulsing in time with my racing heart. Each beat felt like a countdown to something terrible. I tried to focus, to remember every detail of the room, the placement of the furniture, the locations of the candles, the strange implements scattered about. Anything might be important if I was going to find a way out of this nightmare. "The binding is simple," Lady Margaret explained, her voice harmonizing with that otherworldly undertone. It was like listening to two people speak at once, the familiar tones of the Queen's lady-in-waiting overlaid with something ancient and inhuman. Just a drop of blood, freely given, and a few words in the old tongue. Then you'll be part of our little fellowship. As she spoke, I couldn't help but think of all the times I'd seen Lady Margaret with the Queen. The way she'd always hovered nearby, offering advice, guiding decisions. How long had this creature been influencing the crown, and how had no one noticed? My hands shook as I watched her arrange crystal vials filled with liquids that moved against gravity. Each one seemed to contain a different color, but the hues shifted and swirled in ways that made my head ache if I looked at them too long. Behind her, Thomas and Sarah stood motionless, their blank faces reflecting the candlelight. I couldn't help but wonder about their stories. Had they, like me, stumbled upon this secret accidentally? Or had they been lured here, tricked into participating in something they didn't understand? How many others had stood where I was standing, thinking they could outsmart whatever dark power had taken root in the North Tower? But they hadn't spent 15 years learning the palace's secrets. They hadn't memorized every corridor, every hidden passage, every quirk of the ancient building's construction. And most importantly, they hadn't been trained by Mrs. Winters to understand the precise nature of fire and steam. Have you ever noticed how the smallest details of your daily life could become weapons in the right moment? I thought of the laundry room, of the carefully controlled fires we tended day and night to heat water and press linens, of how a single spark in the wrong place could send the whole palace up in flames. And I realized that perhaps my years of mundane labor had prepared me for this moment in ways I never could have imagined. "Before we begin," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, "might I have a moment to compose myself? To prepare for the honor you're bestowing?" The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I pushed on. It's not every day a simple laundry maid is offered such an opportunity. His Grace studied me with those inhuman eyes. For a moment, I feared he'd see through my ruse. But then he nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Of course. We want your participation to be willing. It makes the binding so much stronger." I moved toward the room's single window, making a show of smoothing my apron. The stolen candle pressed against my leg through the fabric, a small comfort in this world of horrors. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn wasn't far off, and with it, the signing ceremony that would seal the Queen's fate, and perhaps the fate of the entire kingdom. "Such a beautiful view of the palace," I murmured, reaching into my pocket. My fingers closed around the candle, its familiar shape grounding me. "You can see all the way to the Queen's chambers from here." "Yes," His Grace said, pride coloring his voice. He moved to stand beside me, his presence making my skin crawl. "After tonight, the view will be even more spectacular. When the old powers return..." I didn't let him finish. In one fluid motion, I struck the candle's wick against the rough stone windowsill, another trick learned from years of watching palace craftsmen light their work lamps. The flame caught instantly, bright and pure in this room of shadows and secrets. "What are you?" Lady Margaret began, but I was already moving. I hurled the lit candle toward the highest beam, where decades of dust and cobwebs waited like tinder. The flame caught, spreading faster than natural fire should. The symbols on the walls began to writhe in earnest now, their eldritch light competing with the growing flames. "Stop her!" His Grace's voice boomed with otherworldly power, but I was already running. The advantage of being a servant is that no one expects you to be brave. No one expects you to fight. They expect you to run, to hide, to cower. And so when you do something truly unexpected, it takes them precious seconds to respond. I didn't run toward the stairs. Instead, I ran straight at Thomas and Sarah's still forms, crashing into them with all my weight. As they toppled like wooden dolls, I grabbed the heavy curtain behind them and yanked with all my strength. The ancient fabric tore free, cascading down onto the ritual table. Vials shattered, their contents mixing with the black candle wax. The symbols on the walls screamed, a sound that existed more in my mind than in my ears, a cacophony of eldritch horror that threatened to shatter my sanity. "The binding circle!" Lady Margaret shrieked, her human disguise slipping to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. Her form seemed to flicker, sometimes human, sometimes something with too many limbs and eyes. "Protect the..." But it was too late. Smoke filled the room, both the mystical fumes from their ritual and the very real smoke from the growing fire above. The ceiling beams crackled, centuries-old wood surrendering to flame. In the chaos, I saw my chance. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I heard His Grace roar, a sound no human throat could produce. Something grabbed at my ankle, but I kicked free, feeling cloth tear and skin scrape against stone. As I reached the stairs, I risked a glance back. The room was transforming, the walls melting like wax as the fire spread. His Grace and Lady Margaret were changing too, their human forms giving way to something nightmarish and incomprehensible. I ran down the spiral stairs, taking them two at a time, praying I wouldn't fall. The tower groaned around me, stone and wood protesting as unnatural fire consumed them. I could hear pursuit behind me, inhuman sounds that spurred me to run faster than I ever had before. When was the last time you discovered strength you didn't know you had? As I reached the tower's base, a terrible realization struck me. Even if I escaped, even if I survived, Who would believe the tale of a simple laundry maid? How could I hope to stop whatever had been set in motion? But as I burst out into the pre-dawn air, gulping in breaths that weren't tainted by smoke and magic, I knew I had to try. For the Queen, for the kingdom, for all the ordinary people who had no idea of the darkness that threatened them. The North Tower burned behind me, flames tinged with unnatural colors reaching toward the lightning sky. And I ran, not toward safety, but toward the only person I could think of who might be able to help, Mrs. Winters. If anyone would know what to do, it would be her. As I raced through the awakening palace, alarms beginning to sound around me, I clutched the torn scrap of paper that had started it all. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. The simple world of linens and laundry was behind me now. Ahead lay mysteries, dangers, and perhaps a chance to save everything I held dear. The palace was awakening to chaos. Bells rang out in alarm, their urgent peals mixing with shouts and the thunderous sound of boots on stone as guards and servants alike rushed to respond to the fire. The scent of smoke hung heavy in the air, carrying with it undertones of that strange metallic odor from the North Tower. I ran through corridors I'd known all my life, but now they seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow held the potential for horror. Every flickering torch threatened to reveal inhuman shapes. My legs burned with exhaustion. My lungs ached from the smoke, but I couldn't stop. Not when the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance. As I rounded a corner, I slammed straight into Mrs. Winters. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her gray hair escaping its tight bun. For a moment, I feared she might be another illusion, another monster wearing a familiar face. But then I saw the concern in her eyes. Human eyes, filled with worry and confusion. Lucy, what in heaven's name? She took in my soot-stained appearance, the tears in my dress, the wild look in my eyes. Then, to my eternal surprise, her expression changed from shock to grim understanding. The Queen's in danger, isn't she? I nodded, gasping for breath. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. How did she know? Had she suspected something all along? But there was no time for explanations. "Follow me," she said, her usual stern expression hardening into something like steel. "There's a direct path to Her Majesty's chambers through the service corridors. And Lucy?" She pulled something from her pocket. A small, worn book, bound in faded leather. "Some of us have been watching the North Tower for a very long time." As we hurried through hidden passages I'd never known existed, Mrs. Winters spoke in hushed tones. She told me of an ancient order of servants, sworn to protect the crown from threats both mundane and mystical. For centuries, they had worked in the shadows, passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. "We've suspected something was wrong for years," she said, as we climbed a narrow staircase. "The signs were there for those who knew how to look, but we never imagined it had gone this far." I thought of all the times I'd seen Mrs. Winters watching, always vigilant, always aware of everything that happened in the palace. How many other servants were part of this secret order? How long had they been preparing for this moment? How often do we discover that we're not as alone in our battles as we thought? We emerged into a richly appointed corridor, just as the Queen's personal guards were escorting her from her chambers. Her Majesty looked confused and frightened, still in her nightclothes with a robe hastily thrown over them. "Your Majesty!" Mrs. Winters called out, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "You must not sign the trade agreement. It's a trap." The guards moved to intercept us, but the Queen held up a hand to stop them. "Mrs. Winters? What is the meaning of this?" Before Mrs. Winters could respond, a silky voice cut through the air. Now, let's not alarm Her Majesty with wild tales." Lord Blackthorn stepped into view, his appearance impeccable despite the early hour. But now that I knew what to look for, I could see the wrongness in his eyes, the too fluid grace of his movements. "The fire in the North Tower is unfortunate," he continued, "but hardly cause to disrupt important matters of state. Your Majesty, we really must proceed with the signing, for the good of the kingdom." I saw the Queen waver, uncertainty crossing her face. In that moment, I knew I had to act. Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I stepped forward. "Your Majesty," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word, "I'm just a laundry maid. I'm nobody important. But I've seen things in the North Tower. Terrible things. His Grace and Lady Margaret, they're not what they seem. They want to use your signature to break some kind of seal, to bring back old powers that should stay buried." Lord Blackthorn's face contorted with rage, his human mask slipping for just a moment. "Guards, seize this girl. She's clearly delusional from the smoke." But the Queen held up her hand again, her gaze fixed on me. "Wait, I want to hear what she has to say." And so, in a rush of words, I told her everything. The note I'd found, the secret meeting I'd overheard, the horrors I'd witnessed in the tower. As I spoke, I saw recognition dawn in her eyes, as if pieces of a puzzle she'd long been trying to solve were finally falling into place. "I felt it," she said softly when I finished. "For years, I've sensed something wrong in the palace. But whenever I tried to investigate, I was distracted, made to forget." Lord Blackthorn moved then, faster than any human should be able to move. But Mrs. Winters was faster still. From beneath her skirts, she pulled out an iron fireplace poker, a simple tool that glowed with sudden power in her hands. "Not one step closer," she growled, placing herself between the Queen and the creature wearing Lord Blackthorn's skin. What happened next was a blur of action. Guards shouted, swords were drawn, and Lord Blackthorn's form began to shift and twist in ways that defied sanity. But through it all, the Queen stood tall, a light beginning to emanate from within her. "I remember," she said, her voice resonating with power. "I remember who I am, what my bloodline means, and I revoke any permission, any right you thought you had to my realm and my people." The words seemed to hit Lord Blackthorn like physical blows. He staggered back, his form flickering between human and something terrifyingly other. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice a cacophony of inhuman tones. "The old powers will return, with or without you." And then he was gone, vanishing in a swirl of shadows that left behind only the scent of smoke and metal. In the aftermath, as guards secured the palace and priests were summoned to cleanse the North Tower, the Queen turned to me. Her eyes, I noticed, seemed to shimmer with an inner light I'd never seen before. "Lucy," she said softly, "you've shown incredible bravery. You may be just a laundry maid, but you've saved the kingdom this day. Whatever you desire, if it's within my power to grant, it's yours." I thought about it for a moment. I could ask for riches, for a noble title, for any number of things that would elevate me far beyond my station. But in the end, only one thing felt right. "Your Majesty," I said, "I want to learn about the hidden history of our kingdom, about the powers that shape our world. I want to serve, not just as a maid, but as a protector, like Mrs. Winters." The Queen smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to chase away the last shadows of the night's horrors. "Then learn you shall. Mrs. Winters, I believe you have a new apprentice." As the morning sun rose fully over the palace, I stood with Mrs. Winters watching the North Tower smolder. The flames still flickered with strange colors, and shadows that defied the light writhed within the smoke. But whatever dark power had taken root, there was weakening, its hold broken by simple fire and a servant's courage. "You'll have questions. Mrs. Winters said quietly. "About what you saw. About what's really been happening in this palace. About why some of us were chosen to watch and wait." She patted the book in her pocket. "When you're ready, there's much more to learn. After all," she added with the ghost of a smile, "someone will need to take my place eventually." I looked at her, then back at the burning tower, understanding slowly dawning. Sometimes the most important guardians are the ones no one thinks to watch, the ones who clean the rooms, wash the linens, and keep the secrets hidden in plain sight. As I stood there, on the precipice of a new life I could never have imagined, I thought of all the ordinary people in the kingdom, the bakers and blacksmiths, the farmers and fishermen. They would never know how close they had come to darkness this day. But that, I realized, was the true nature of service, to protect not just the crown, but every soul who called this land home. "I'm ready," I said to Mrs. Winters, squaring my shoulders. "Where do we start?" She smiled, a mix of pride and determination in her eyes. "We start, my dear, with a very special load of laundry. After all, eldritch horrors are no excuse for wrinkled linens." And with that, we turned away from the burning tower and walked back into the palace. There was work to be done, a kingdom to protect, and secrets to keep safe. But for the first time, I felt truly ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Would you like to know what other secrets lie behind these palace walls?